Something funny?
I just muted myself.
Oh,
That was embarrassing.
there we go. With that being said, this evening I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Orion McCarthy here. He is a marine biologist with expertise in coral reef ecology, conservation technology, and ecosystem restoration. So he recently earned his doctorates from Scripps Institution of Oceanography over in San Diego there, where he studied under Dr. Jennifer Smith. Orion spent the last 6 years studying the drivers of change over time on Maui Nui's coral reefs and looking for signs of reef resilience. So without further delay, please help me provide a warm welcome to Dr. Orion.
Thank you, Tiara. It's newly minted, so I'm not used to hearing Dr. Orion. Yes, and also that introduction, I guess I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Orion McCarthy. I recently got my PhD from Scripps Institution of Oceanography in California, and as Tiara said, have spent most of my time at Scripps studying change over time on Maui Nui's coral reefs. But unlike a traditional science talk, I'm going to try sort of a different format tonight. I'm going to avoid sharing a lot of graphs and statistics, although there will be a few. Instead, I'm going to rely more heavily on visuals and storytelling to communicate some of the observations from our fieldwork, including this fieldwork trip that we're here doing, and just observations about reef degradation, recovery, and resilience. So let's talk story. Specifically, let's talk about the theme of this presentation, storytelling. For millennia, storytelling has been used across cultures to share knowledge and form community. And this is especially true in native Hawaiian culture, where oral storytelling, chants, and dance were used in lieu of written language to teach the next generation about history, traditions, values, and beliefs. And beyond any single culture, stories are a powerful tool for communicating what is important to us and for sharing our experiences with others. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own story. I didn't have the good fortune of growing up here in Hawaii, right next to the ocean. I grew up on the East Coast, just outside of Washington, D.C., and my connection to the ocean was forged through summer crab feasts, annual trips to the beach, and visits to the aquarium. Or sometimes when the real aquarium was not possible, I resorted to making my own in our bathtub. So during my early childhood, this love for the ocean sort of led to me getting a lot of field guides and watching a ton of nature documentaries and developing a deep love of science and a concern about the state of the natural world. And this passion is what inspired me to pursue a career in conservation, but I wasn't really sure what form that would necessarily take. So I started broad with pursuing biology at the University of Maryland, and then I spent a semester abroad at James Cook University in Australia, where I was introduced to coral reef ecology and also what a career in marine conservation could look like. And then after that, several pivotal early work experiences in fisheries science and ocean policy really helped to hone my passion for the environment towards more of a curiosity about the science behind conservation and in figuring out ways to merge ecology and conservation together so that we can make conservation more effective. And this is why I was interested in joining Dr. Jennifer Smith's lab at Scripps. Jen is broadly focused on solutions-based marine science, and she has projects that focus on our local ecosystems in California, such as kelp forests and rocky reefs, and also projects like mine that are based in tropical ecosystems like coral reefs. Jen herself got her start as a marine botanist at UH, where she spent years doing research on Maui, studying invasive species and the impact of the injection wells off of Kakakili on the reef there. And after her career took her back to the mainland, Jen maintained her Maui connection through her students' research. Some of her first PhD students investigated the feeding preferences of herbivorous fish and urchins on the reef to better understand how they were impacting the ecosystem. And their science was helpful in establishing the Kakakili herbivorous fisheries management area back in 2009. But within the last decade, our lab's Maui research has focused a lot more on documenting change over time so that we can better understand human and environmental drivers that are responsible for reef degradation here on Maui. Now, unfortunately for coral reefs, there are many different potential drivers of degradation, and that includes threats such as overfishing and nutrient pollution that are tied to more local scale human impacts, which are shown here in purple, And then it also includes threats that are linked to climate change, such as stronger storms, marine heat waves, ocean acidification, and sea level rise, which are shown here in yellow. I split these out because for local resource managers, it's a lot easier to address the threats that are in purple because we need global action to address the climate threats. And importantly, any of these stressors can interact with each other, and a reef may be exposed to multiple different stressors at any given point in time. And these stressors have already caused major degradation on coral reefs worldwide. It's estimated that half of all coral cover has been lost since 1950. Now, given the current state of affairs, it's no surprise that I'm often asked this question: are coral reefs doomed? No doubt about it, the situation for coral reefs is dire, but I really don't like the doom and gloom narrative, and it's primarily for this reason. It leads people to ask this question: why study coral reefs or dedicate resources to conserving them if reef decline is inevitable? And I'm going to tell you a few reasons today why coral reef decline is not inevitable. While coral reefs are indeed threatened, the doom and gloom narrative misses two key points. First, coral reefs are dynamic ecosystems that change in response to their environment. Yes, coral reefs can experience a sudden decline after bleaching or a storm, but just like a forest after a wildfire, coral reefs can show impressive recovery if given the chance. The real problem arises when disturbance events occur back to back to back without sufficient time for a reef to recover. And this is the issue that faces reefs under climate change and why we need global action to reduce carbon emissions and halt the rise in global temperatures. But even amidst more frequent storms and stronger heat waves, reefs have the capacity for resilience. And there's been multiple studies that have looked across the globe to try to identify high-performing reefs that show signs of hope. And actually, some of those studies have even shown that Maui is one of those locations that has high resilience compared to elsewhere in the world. So the second reason I'm hopeful about reefs is the simple fact that no two coral reefs are the same. Each reef experiences a unique set of environmental conditions and disturbance over time, and this helps to shape the habitat structure of a reef and the species that live there. Just think of a coral reef like a town or a community. Its character and inhabitants are shaped by its location and its unique history. This local context is extremely important, especially when we think about creating policies designed to promote resilience and recovery. Strategies that work in one location might not be well suited for another. So for conservation to be effective, we must understand this local context. We need to understand each reef's story. When I arrived at Scripps back in 2018, my goal was to harness our Maui Time series to really inform conservation. And I quickly realized that at Scripps, we had the power of technology at our fingertips to be able to tell each reef's unique story over time. The Smith Lab and our partners in the Sandin Lab at Scripps use a type of imaging technology that creates 3D reconstructions of coral reefs. These reconstructions effectively allow us to peel back the ocean and look at what a reef looks like to a diver, and allows us to share that with all of you and to study it in detail. A quick overview of how this technology works. When we go into the field, such as our trip right now, we swim above the reef with a camera rig and we take a picture every second. Now, we don't swim quite that fast as in that video, but we basically image an area a little smaller than the size of this room, and we swim over the reef taking thousands of pictures. And so you can see here, we aim to get good coverage where there's a lot of overlap between the pictures. For example, you can see this red dot. It's the same in all different pictures. And that coverage allows us to use an algorithm called structure from motion to reconstruct those pictures into a 3D model. And we can use that 3D model to create other data products, such as a height map or digital elevation model of the reef, and a big 2D high-resolution map of the reef called the orthoprojection. And all of this data together is referred to as large area imagery, and that's what I'll be referring to for the rest of this talk. So here's an example of a fully reconstructed coral reef model from one of our sites over on Kaho'olawe. Visiting this and other reefs over on Kaho'olawe was an incredible opportunity, both to learn about the cultural significance of that island, but also to see what an unfished and protected reef looks like in Hawaii. This site and much of our time series was collected in collaboration with the 100 Island Challenge, which is an initiative spearheaded by our partner lab, the Sandin Lab at Scripps. The 100 Island Challenge seeks to document global drivers of coral reef change over time by imaging reefs with this technology across over 100 islands around the world and looking for global patterns. While my work does feed into this broader initiative, my project is more specifically focused on the Maui Nui region and how reefs are changing here. So starting in 2014, Jen and her former student, Emily Kelly, started collecting imagery of fixed sites around leeward Maui, and in 2017 they broadened that effort to include the neighboring 3 islands, with about 8 sites on each of the neighboring islands. So this is basically just a map of the location of our study sites. And this year we're concentrating primarily on Maui. It's really been a highlight of my PhD experience to be able to come back to Maui every year and to revisit these reefs and to watch how both the reefs and the community have changed over the years. Unfortunately, change is not always good or kind, and the last year has brought an abundance of change following the tragic Lahaina fire that killed over 100 people. Lahaina was our home base for fieldwork each year, and seeing videos of it go up in flames was truly devastating, although I'm sure nothing compared to the pain that all of you felt. While none of our partners lost their lives, several lost property or their livelihoods, and the fires serve as a stark reminder that climate change will not only test the resilience of ecological communities, but of our human communities as well. The ecological impact of the wildfires from debris and runoff is not yet fully known, and that highlights the urgent need for data-informed conservation decision-making here in Maui. So one of the goals of our trip this year is to broaden our survey effort to capture some of the initial impacts from the wildfires near Lahaina. And you'll notice our pre-existing time series had a bit of a gap around Lahaina, which was partially because we were going on the conventional knowledge from our advisor and others that there aren't really well-established reefs really close to Lahaina. So this year, we aimed to fill in some of that gap by collaborating with Maui Pacific Divers, the Pacific Whale Foundation, to survey some additional sites along the coast here. You can see in red, stretching from Mala down to Laniapoko. So before I talk about our observations from these sites near Lahaina, I want to talk a bit more about some of our other sites where we have some longer term data. But I will say that we tried to pick, even though this is our first time visiting these sites, we picked locations where there's pre-existing coral cover data so that we would have something to compare our observations to. So all our fieldwork wouldn't be possible without the support of our great partners here on Maui, including the Division of Aquatic Resources, Ultimate Whale Watch, TNC, Maui Nui Marine Resource Council, Pacific Whale Foundation, Maui Pacific Divers, and also researchers from the DeVries Lab at San Jose State and the Donovan Lab at UH. And it's truly been a pleasure to work with this community. They're also dedicated to supporting research and documenting how very important reefs here are changing. Now, in addition to the people, I want to take a moment to introduce you to the other main characters of this story, the corals and algae that live on the reef. Unfortunately, our 3D models don't capture the fish, so we aren't the fish experts. But basically, if you're a snorkeler or a diver, you probably would recognize some of these corals. Each of them plays a slightly different role, filling unique niches on the reef, and they're primarily Montipora and Parietes corals are the main architects of Hawaiian reefs, but there's also this Studycoral coral that is pretty charismatic that you might have seen when you're snorkeling. But overall, Parietes lobata, part of the reason I'm identifying this one separately is because it is one of the biggest reef builders. It's also one of the most stress-tolerant corals, so you'll often see this one survive through disturbance events better than some of the others. There's some of the big yellow or green hemispherical colonies that you see out on the reef. Other species, such as Montipora and Studycoral, are faster growing but a little bit more susceptible to bleaching. And then Jen would kill me if I didn't mention the algae. Corals are not the only ones growing on the seafloor. Space is really a premium on coral reefs. The corals and the algae are all competing with each other for limited space. And especially the macroalgae and turf algae can be really detrimental to corals if there aren't healthy fish populations to keep them in check. But there's also this calcifying pink algae called crustose-coralline algae, or CCA, that helps to bind the reef together and can actually promote coral reproduction by serving as a substrate for coral babies to land on. So even though there's both corals and algae on reefs, coral cover tends to be the metric that most people will readily go to communicate the health of a reef or its current condition. And so this map over here is showing the coral cover of our sites the year that we started our full Maui Nui time series. So we noticed a pattern where there's more coral cover on the islands with less people, which is not a huge novel finding. That's a lot of people have documented that before us, and it makes sense because a lot of those local impacts that I talked about earlier are reduced on islands with fewer people. But one thing I think that our time series was showing that is new is just the rates of coral cover change at this level of detail across the whole region. And what is interesting to me is that it isn't a clear pattern of Maui is declining, the other islands are doing better. It's far more mixed and nuanced. And it seems like actual coral cover is not a good predictor of change of coral cover in the future. You can have a site with very high coral cover that will decline over time, a site with low coral cover that will increase. And so it's not as straightforward as all reefs are declining or all reefs are stable, or one island is doing great and the other island is not. And part of the reason for this variability is that the disturbances that impact coral reefs and cause coral cover to decline are very patchy. For example, if you have a storm come through, the direction of the waves will naturally have bigger impacts in certain parts of the coastline than others. If you're a reef near a stream outflow, there'll be more sediment impact than if you're just a little further up the shore. If you're in a sheltered bay during a heat wave, that water will heat up a lot more than if you're off the coast a little bit and the water's moving around. And because that all varies at a very small scale, you can get this patchiness where you have a healthy reef right next to an unhealthy reef. So suffice it to say, disentangling these different disturbances and trying to figure out what's driving change on a reef in any given place can be really challenging. And that's why long-term monitoring is such a powerful tool, because it gives us this longer time horizon to understand the natural history of a given place. So for this talk, I'm going to focus in on the story of some of our key long-term sites in leeward Maui. And I want to highlight some of this local context that I've been talking about, context that I'm sure many of you are familiar with as residents here, but I still want to introduce it for anyone who might not be aware. I already discussed the recent impacts around Lahaina, and I'll get to sort of our observations from those surveys we did towards the end of the talk. Focusing on some of our other sites, there's pretty big tourism infrastructure, including wastewater infrastructure near Kihei and up at Kaanapali, and those do have impacts on the reef just offshore. Up by Kahekili, there is the benefit of the herbivorous fisheries management area that I mentioned before, where they restrict fishing of herbivores, and that is supposed to help maintain or keep a lid on the algae population so that corals have a chance on those reefs. Over on Molokini, is another protected area, although there are still large human impacts from, I'm sure you guys have seen the number of boats that go out to Molokini every single day. So it's definitely not a pristine, unimpacted site, but it is offshore and sort of a unique spot compared to the other reefs on Maui. And then there's also just feet away from us in Mahalaya, there is some reef just outside the harbor. And that's actually going to be the first coral reef story that I'm going to discuss today. So this 3D model fly-through is actually 2 different years overlapping in a 3D model. And what it's basically showing is wherever there's red, that means from 2021 to 2023, the reef structure disappeared or was broken off. And wherever there's blue, that means the reef grew. And so you'll see some of the parts of the reef, there's not really any color, so nothing changed much. But then you see some instances of really big change. That coral is probably about half the size of this table up here. So something came through and removed that huge coral colony. And you'll see these other parts of the reef, there's again not that much difference. That one coral colony grew a little bit. But what we are able to notice by layering these models on top of each other is where these instances of structural damage are concentrated. And on shallow reefs like Mahalaya, you can see that that in these channels that basically funnel water through, that there's more concentrated impacts of the reef getting scoured away when there's a big storm or wave event. And I'll let the model fly through here a little bit more, because a lot of the damage is really concentrated in that area, with the exception of that one big Paragus colony that got removed and left behind sort of a crater in the reef. So this is what did that. The big south swell in 2022, freight trains was going off and the surfers were happy and the coral reef was not, because it was only in 10 feet of water and these waves were probably about the height of the depth of the water. So our reef, it's not really that surprising that we would see such a big impact. Honestly, seeing the size of these waves, I'd be surprised if we went back later and didn't see a big change. But it definitely shows up in the coral cover change. This diagram here is a map of the different colors are corals, basically a spatial layout of our 10 by 10 meter plot. So basically colors mean corals, and then you can see 2 years later there's a lot of gray, which is signifying the algae. So usually when we're talking about change over time in corals, we're talking about a couple of %. Corals grow slowly, there's usually not huge changes. So a drop from over 60% to just above 30% coral cover is pretty big, but again, those are pretty big waves. So this scale of damage will probably take time to recover from, and we're actually going out to Maui tomorrow morning, so we'll see what it looks like. Now let's zoom out from an acute site-specific impact like that wave event to a disturbance that impacted the entire region, coral bleaching. You've probably heard a bit about coral bleaching, being here in Hawaii, but I want to provide a bit of background for anyone who's not aware of how coral bleaching works. Basically, bleaching can occur whenever a coral gets stressed, but it's most often seen as in response to elevated ocean temperatures. When this happens, corals lose their partnership with symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae that live inside their tissues. And under normal conditions, these algae are actually what make corals so colorful, and they provide corals with a source of food. So basically, when that partnership breaks down, a bleached coral is still alive, but if it doesn't regain that partnership soon enough, it'll actually starve to death, because corals are animals and they have metabolism and need energy. So with bleaching, a lot of the severity of the impacts depend on how long the corals remain bleached for and if they have the time to recover. But I do want to stress that a bleached coral is not necessarily going to die. It does have a chance to recover. So we're going to move from Maui now to Oluwalu to look at the impact of bleaching over the course of 7 years of our time series. Here you can see in 2015 and 2019, there was bleaching when the ocean temperatures spiked. We were fortunate enough that our trips actually aligned with those hot water events, so we were able to capture imagery during both bleaching events. For my research, I was also fortunate that the severity of both bleaching events was actually very similar here at our sites in Maui. So it allowed us to do a pretty direct comparison between the bleaching response we observed in 2015 and 2019 to see if there was a difference, because given that the heat stress was the same, we would expect a similar response from the corals. And if we see less bleaching in 2019, it could be indicative of acclimatization or some positive signs of coral resilience. But what I really love about this time series is it highlights the individual variability between different coral colonies. These corals are all on the same reef, experiencing the same environmental conditions, yet you have some corals that bleach after 2015 and die, and some that sail right on through and don't mind. And so trying to figure out what is driving that is an area of very active research beyond just my project. So we can use our 3D models to actually trace the outlines of individual corals in different years and follow them over time. And basically, by pairing that with image data of assessing what the bleaching severity is for a coral in 2015 and 2019, we can see if a coral is showing evidence of acclimatization, if it's growing, and how its survival is. And we can compare that between different locations and across different species of corals. And so that's what one of my PhD chapters was about, and basically what this graph is showing is this key here down in the corner basically indicates for an individual coral colony how it performed across the 2 bleaching events. So the thermally tolerant colonies didn't bleach in either bleaching event, And the ones that might be showing signs of acclimatization bleached during 2015 and then didn't in 2019. And again, we can follow the same individuals over time with these 3D models. So we can put them into these categories based on how their bleaching response was. And then some corals, of course, didn't make it all the way, and those are shown in gray. And so here you can see differences between different species, here in the different graphs, and then different sites in the panels. And that's basically the proportion of all the corals that we looked at. And so, for example, the Studycoral didn't really do so well. A lot of those died off after the first bleaching event. And now if you go out diving, most of the Studycoral that you see on the reef are probably new coral babies that have come since 2015, now that we're almost a decade out from that event. But I do want to highlight that there's obviously some differences between species, with the Studycoral not being very thermally tolerant, but also a few differences between sites, where you can see these arrows in blue are pointed to some more of the more resilient populations, where they either have lower rates of mortality, or like in the case of Montipora capitata at Kahekili, where there was a lot of corals that didn't bleach, even though there was a lot of bleaching at some of the other sites that we were monitoring. So there's of course the flip side of that, where some sites did worse than others, and so this is helpful data to sort of interrogate what factors are driving certain sites to be more resilient than others. Is it the inherent nature of those individual corals? Is it the environmental factors that are specific to those locations, like I was mentioning earlier? And following these colonies through time has helped us to start to disentangle some of that. And one of the big questions we had that was related to conservation was related to coral restoration, because lots of coral restoration efforts are focused on finding thermally tolerant corals that they can use, so that in the future, those reefs that people have spent so much time restoring, that those reefs won't be impacted by bleaching in the same way in the future. So interestingly, our results, we found that even though corals, some bleached more than others, it's not like the ones that survived and didn't bleach did a lot better over time than others. So basically what this graph is showing, I'll turn this way, is the size of the coral at the beginning of our time series compared to the size at the end. And this red line here is showing a coral that is the same size when we started and when we ended. So anything above that diagonal red line is a coral that grew over time, and anything below it is a coral that shrank and lost area. And so this is just looking at the surviving corals. It's not looking at ones that died after the first bleaching event or the second. And what I want you to take away from this is that these different groups, the thermally tolerant group, the group that bleached every time, they're overlapping with each other. It's not like the corals that didn't bleach are growing more. So basically what this is, we're trying to emphasize with this is that a coral surviving through bleaching events should be evidence of their resilience. I don't think we, at least based on our observations in Hawaii, need to invest a whole lot of infrastructure in trying to figure out the specific bleaching history of every single coral. If we go out and can find big, healthy-looking, robust colonies that have been around on the reef for a while, that should be evidence in and of itself that it is a resilient individual, because to get to that size, it must have been here for a while and existed through these multiple bleaching events that have tested it and weeded out the more susceptible individuals. Now, one of our sites that had low growth rates and not very good survivorship was this site at Keakupu, which is just off of Kihei Boat Ramp. And I really like this site just from it's got lots of fish, cool 3D structure, but the corals are not doing so happy, at least specific corals are not. If you look at the orange encrusting corals in the video, you'll see as they move from left to right that most of them will disappear. And this reef went from a more diverse reef back when we started our time series to a bit of a graveyard in some senses, where there's just really one species of coral and a lot of bare space. And the visuals show one aspect of that, and I'll put up a graph to show the other of just, you can see this is the similar color scheme to the map I showed before, where the colors, everything below the pink are different species of corals, and then above the pink and above are different types of algae. So you can see over time, especially after the first bleaching event in 2015, how there was a drop in coral cover, and then a slow, steady decline up until this year. But you'll also notice that the share of corals that are green, which are the Montipora corals, they've also declined as you've gone from a reef that is more diverse to a reef that is basically just the branching parietes and a lot of bare space. So we're not entirely sure what's driving that shift. We have a number of theories, including pollution or bioerosion by urchins, outbreaks of coral predators, different bleaching susceptibility of Montipora being more sensitive than parietes. But it is definitely a noticeable trend of that shift in diversity at this site. So another site that I want to talk about that did show impacts from bleaching is situated just offshore. And inside that submerged crater are some of the best reefs in all of Maui Nui, which is why all the tourist boats go there. But it really is a special and pristine place, and it does have much higher fish biomass due to very long-term protection, and it being situated further offshore where the pelagics can sort of interface with the reef a little bit. But I do remember witnessing high rates of bleaching at Molokini during my first field season in 2019. So a lot of these corals were not the happiest while I was there. Yet, unlike Yavanapu, Molokini's corals really pulled through with no noticeable blip in 2019. And perhaps that's because in 2015, a lot of the more susceptible corals were weeded out, and just because it is a more diverse, protected reef with lots of fish, it was able to be more resilient and pull through. And I'll note that Molokini has very high coral cover compared to a lot of other reefs in Maui, so the competition for space on that reef is very intense, very limited free space. But marine protected areas cannot entirely eliminate drivers of reef decline, as our recent trips to Molokini have shown. Now, crown of thorns starfish, as some of you might have heard of them, they've been a problem on Molokini for a number of years, but recently they exploded in abundance. And the reason they're a problem is because crown of thorns starfish eat corals. And they are naturally occurring predators of corals that occur on coral reefs, but they become a problem when you get these outbreaks of them, where you have you can go from a single crown of thorns on a reef to dozens, if not hundreds. And these crown of thorns crawl around and they actually exude their stomach and digest the corals. And what you're seeing here in this video in white is the bare coral skeleton because the coral has been eaten. So this was during our last field season in 2023. And here you can see where all that white coral was. Now there's just bare turf algae, open substrate. So it really is a lot like a wildfire front moving through and clearing a bunch of open space. And the estimated drop in coral cover here, we haven't crunched the numbers because again, we just collected that second time point last week. But I would guess it's probably a similar magnitude drop in coral to what I showed you at Mahalaya, where I think this reef was probably around 70 to 75% coral cover before, and now probably about 30 to 40%. And again, that's not all of Molokini, that's just in our area that we're monitoring. But it is definitely a big impact from these starfish. But I will point out the one thing you might notice from this video is the really selective feeding of the starfish, where they are going and primarily targeting the encrusting Montipora and leaving the more massive Parietes lobata and the branching Montipora alone. So one thing I will say that is sort of a positive note that we've noticed is that crown of thorns are really messy eaters, and they'll leave behind little remnants of tissue that are in cracks and crevices. And this encrusting Montipora coral is really good at resheeting and regrowing over the reef. And while this isn't from the same part of Molokini, it's our shallow site instead, it still is that same species of coral, and you can see over time, over a number of years, how it grows and eventually, sort of just like a front, moves back and recolonizes that space. So there is the theory that the crown of thorns come in, they clear a bunch of open space, and over time, as the Montipora comes back in and fills those holes, there's open space for other types of corals to settle and grow and helps to maintain this high level of diversity that we see in Molokini. And the Division of Aquatic Resources has actually observed a similar pattern at Kanahena Point, where they had a crown of thorns outbreak that drastically reduced coral cover, and coral did recover. It took time, but it did recover. And the diversity of the coral community increased a lot. And they noted that each year they would go back, there was sort of a different species that was dominant, as you had sort of the early colonizers and then some of the later colonizers. And this is a pattern that we noticed across Maui Nui, not just at Molokini or Dar, like Dar noticed at Kaneha Point. So we note some reefs that experience less frequent disturbance that look more like this, where there's this really impressive coral cover, these delicate plating corals, and coral cover can be upwards of 75 to 80%, sort of rivaling Molokini, at least in terms of coral cover. The fish is usually not as impressive as Molokini. On the other end of the spectrum, you'll have reefs that are either been recently exposed to a big disturbance like Maui, or reefs that are just growing in a very challenging area, like on a wavy coastline or something. And then you have reefs in the middle that are either recovering from a disturbance that happened a while ago, or are frequently impacted by small disturbances that help to clear space. And those reefs are the ones that tend to be the most diverse. So we categorized for our data our different types of reefs. We have the lower coral cover reefs that are dominated by stress-tolerant corals, the high coral cover reefs that are dominated by Montipora and almost no free space, and then those diverse intermediate reefs. And we mapped our study sites based on those different types of reefs. And again, there's a lot of variability, but a bit of a pattern where around some Lanai and Molokai, there's more of those pristine reefs, and on Maui you have a lot of the earlier successional stages where the reefs, there's been some free space cleared out, there's more of the stress-tolerant corals. So we can use these categories to analyze how coral cover has changed over our time series. So remember, the darker color is those more degraded reefs, lighter color are the more pristine reefs, and this is each time step of our full Maui Nui time series. And up there just showing some of the notable types of disturbance that impacted the region in those years. So you'll see that since 2019, a lot of the gains in coral cover have actually come from the more degraded reefs, while some of the higher coral cover pristine reefs have seen declines. And so this is really interesting because it really is a different narrative than a lot of, we want to have the highest coral cover possible at all costs. We don't want to invest resources towards conserving the degraded reefs. And I don't want to say that degradation is good. Degraded reefs still lack diversity. They may not fulfill all the ecosystem services that a pristine reef does. But I think our findings do suggest a different view of coral reef resilience, one where chronic stress and human impacts can remove sensitive individuals from a population and leave behind a system that has lower diversity but more stability, because those stress-tolerant individuals are what is dominating. And those degraded reefs can still benefit from conservation efforts to reduce local human impacts, and these reefs shouldn't be ignored in the context of conservation. They really do have the potential for resilience. And one of my favorite sites is one of those that when I first started seeing it back in 2019 was a little bit degraded, just off the coast of Wahakuli. And it was pretty heavily impacted back in the 2015 bleaching event. This one big Phragmites colony, you'll see in a second, completely bleached in 2015 and mostly died back. And a lot of other smaller corals on that reef also perished during that bleaching event. But we did see over the course of our monitoring that the recovery started and then it was sort of flatlined by the 2019 bleaching event, then it picked back up, and we saw a lot of baby corals and regrowth occurring, which was a very encouraging sign. And so this is from this year. Again, we haven't had a chance to make the 3D model yet, but a lot of this recovery is driven either by the settlement of new baby individual corals onto the reef, which are injecting new genetics, new diversity, and then also this impressive recovery of coral tissue that we all thought was dead back when it bleached in 2015. And this is that same coral years later, and you see it's sort of starting to emerge from little pockets of tissue that had survived that bleaching event. So, I mean, talk about resilient, something that was knocked almost all the way back down, and if you give it still a bit more time, but it's similar size to some of the other smaller corals on that reef, and if you give it enough time without disturbance, it'll come back and resheet. And so The recovery doesn't look like a huge upswing, so it's not as impressive as some of the declines we're seeing, but oftentimes in ecology, the decline is going to be a lot more dramatic than the recovery. The recovery is slow, it takes time, but what is important is that it is persistent. And here you can see this reef is very stable and persistent, which is notable because it's just offshore of a stream, it's very close to shore, it's not like it's an unimpacted place. And so I think we really should celebrate these types of reefs. Not forget about the pristine reefs, but make sure to celebrate these reefs that are holding on in places that we wouldn't think we'd necessarily find a vibrant, healthy coral reef. And so this was just last week diving at Wahakuli. I will say it could probably use some more fish. A lot of reefs could use more fish, but at least the corals looked very healthy. So this is sort of putting together a lot of our key long-term monitoring sites from our time series just to get sort of that 30,000-foot picture of how these reefs have been changing over time. You know, we have coral cover here on the y-axis, and then looking forward through time, you can see the two bleaching events. I'll say that overall, when you look across all the different sites, it doesn't look like a lot of change. And that's actually a pattern that has been noted in other parts of the world, where there's individual sites that are bouncing up and down, but the overall region isn't changing all that much. And that's why I think that the devising conservation strategies, you really need to be looking at that site level to understand which places are doing well, which ones are not, because if the overall pattern is not a lot of change, then you might think, oh, we don't really need to do that much. But some reefs are really improving without our help, others are really struggling and could probably use some more help. And so again, this local context, targeted approach is what's really needed to inform coral conservation. But another encouraging note is if we zoom even further out and look beyond when our time series started to data that was collected by the Division of Aquatic Resources starting back at the turn of the century, we can see for several of our sites this really remarkable stability of coral cover over the course of multiple decades. And what this basically means, if I hopped in the water as a 6-year-old, I would see a reef that looks very similar at these places to what we're seeing now, which is really encouraging and I think goes against a lot of that narrative I mentioned before about the reefs are already doomed. And I think that we need to strike a middle ground between we need action to save these reefs, but they're not already gone and dead. So I promised not a lot of graphs. I still have some graphs, but no more graphs from here on out. We're going to shift now to focus on Lahaina and what we've observed. And so really, what does all this other context from the region mean for the reefs off of Lahaina? Nearly a year later, our team was really apprehensive about going to these reefs. We weren't sure what we would find. And we expected to really see minimal impacts from the fires at most of our other sites, but probably some concentrated impacts right along the coastline, given how, I was mentioning, disturbance can be very patchy and very concentrated. But when we hopped in the water to do our surveys, we were pleasantly surprised. Coral cover looked comparable to those baseline estimates that we had. And so it seems like there's no immediately apparent die-off that happened from directly after the fires, say from debris being washed off and completely smothering the reef. And that makes sense to me because these reefs every winter are impacted by a lot of runoff and sedimentation, and they still exist in these coastal systems, so they must be adapted to at least a certain amount of debris being deposited. And so we basically, I can say, even though we haven't crunched the numbers on coral cover, I can say that the declines that we've seen at Mahalaya and Molokini, there isn't that scale of decline from the fires at Lahaina. So this is a 3D model that I just finished building like a few hours ago. So it's not as high quality as some of the other videos, but this is from just off of Front Street. And it's a reef that we didn't know even existed there. Until we started hopping in the water and was pleasantly surprised that it looked like more coral covered than some of our estimates from past data and from Google Earth. So encouraging to see that well-developed reef system. And then, of course, from Mala down to Lanipopo, saw lots of fun critters that were still inhabiting the reef, still calling it their home. I don't know if they even know how much things changed above water, but they're just going about their lives down below the waves. But Just because we didn't see any major impacts doesn't mean that there aren't any, especially if, I hope if you've taken anything away from my talk, it's that a lot of these changes take time to manifest, whether good or bad. And I think that the big question mark relates to some of those longer term impacts, such as the water quality, potential toxins from runoff, and even the impact of future development as Lahaina rebuilds. And so I think these are all things that we'll need to be monitoring very closely going forward in the future. And in that spirit, we did monitor a site in Lanipoco that's very close to the dump site where they're putting a lot of the debris from the fire cleanup. And encouragingly, the reef looked healthy. But I think this will be a very important baseline to continue to return to and monitor going forward to answer some of the public's very reasonable questions about what impacts will that site have on the local ecosystem. And so I think that being able to track that over time is really the way we have to approach monitoring an impact, because it's not going to happen overnight. These corals aren't all just going to disappear, but we do need to have an early warning signal if there is a big negative impact on the ecosystem. So I'll brief detour. My other hat, now that I'm no longer a grad student at Scripps, is I recently became the science lead for Sea Trees, which is basically a nonprofit that helps to fund marine restoration projects around the world, including coral reefs and also coastal watersheds. And so there is one of our local partners that we're helping to fund is located in Maui, just right off of Lanipoco. And they're basically focusing on removing trash and invasive species to help improve the health of the watershed. And so just basically, not only do we need to do long-term monitoring, it is also beneficial to do restoration, and then to do monitoring of that restoration to make sure it's having a positive impact that is intended. So I think if we take a strategy of both looking at the coral reef just offshore of the dump site and doing active restoration to improve that watershed, I think that's probably the right strategy to go to that local site's specific context and trying to devise context-specific conservation. So I've been talking about the importance of long-term monitoring, and the real experts on this island for long-term monitoring are the Division of Aquatic Resources. They've been monitoring these reefs since, as you saw in the picture, since I was very little. And so they've been doing it mostly the old school way of swimming along a transect and taking smaller pictures and getting a detailed view of a much smaller area of reef. So what we did this time is we've been helping them use some of this large area imagery to document their transects. And you'll notice that the model looks a bit different. It's a much longer transect than our 10 by 10 meter plots. They're covering a very large area, and they're trying to add it into an already existing workflow. And it's been a really fun challenge to figure out how to build their capacity to do that monitoring in the long term and improve the science that they're already doing. So that's been a big part of this trip. The other part was collaborating with Pacific Whale Foundation for our Lahaina response surveys. And before we went out with Pacific divers, we spent a day doing shore diving and imaging one of their sites in Mala, right next to the wharf. And so PacWhale completed their first post-fire surveys of multiple transects in Mala and Olowalu in October 2023. And their focus was really on wildfire response and trying to look for impacts. And they're starting to move towards using large area imagery to document that change. And so it was a really good collaborative opportunity to collect this baseline data along with them. And now it is available if they want to continue monitoring those sites. They have a baseline almost 1 year after the fires. And it's a great data set to continue building on, and a resource that will hopefully only get more valuable year after year. And then one more way to use these visuals for storytelling that I want to highlight is actually a sort of side project that I was working on with my sister, who is a professional animator. And she, as I was talking about my research, she would be interested in finding a way to make it even more visually appealing and accessible. And so we came up with this interface that we were hoping to get funded to turn out into an interactive, but right now we're just sort of treating it as sort of a video tour through our monitoring sites and our data. And right now you can see that map view, but you can also zoom in, and she was able to add the fish. We can't do it with our actual scientific data, but she took some artistic liberties and added in the fish. And so I'm sure you all can imagine how you can, using this as a communication tool, can do probably even a better job than I was able to do in this talk to really highlight a lot of the changes that we're seeing in a relatable way and try to communicate these important local messages of what a site needs in terms of its conservation and protection. And so, again, we're trying to leverage these visuals to tell a story that can be useful for conservation. So, almost at the end, I'd just like to take a moment to reiterate some of the key points from this research. First, we do need global action to address climate change. I've been talking about resilient reefs, but really without some sort of action to address climate change, the future is going to get worse over time for coral reefs and other marine ecosystems. But we also need localized, specific conservation that's tailored to address the unique local threats that each reef faces. Luckily, conservation technology like large area imagery can help us to study and visualize the change on coral reefs across multiple different scales, and we must ensure that there's equitable access to this technology. We can't only have the academic institutions using it, the local partners who live right next to the reefs have to be able to use it to monitor the reefs in their backyard. And I want to stress that coral reef decline is not a foregone conclusion. We have the agency and the power to address the local threats on this island to create healthier coral reefs. And I want us to make sure we don't ignore the degraded reefs. As we've seen today, they have the capacity for resilience and should not be overlooked in the context of conservation. So I want to take a brief moment to thank all of our local partners. This work truly couldn't happen without all of you guys, and it's also for my advisor, Darla, and Emily for having the foresight to start this time series way back before I even knew what a career in conservation could look like. They had the foresight to do this, and I think that highlights how these long-term data sets pay dividends over time and can benefit people who aren't even thinking about that as part of their life, or how the reef is doing, or if the reef near them is going to take a turn or something like that. You need the foresight to have this resource well in advance. So thank them for that. And just for the Division of Aquatic Resources, especially for almost all of our boat days this time have been with them, and it's just been a huge help. Although we do miss our normal boat captains at Ultimate Whale Watch, who normally take us out. And then our new partners at United Pacific Divers and Pac Whale, and just like continuing to build these collaborations and partnerships has been such a treat. And I hope to continue that in the future. So with that, I will stop talking and take any questions.